Welcome to the IT Free Training video on how claim-based federation identity systems work. There are many different examples of these kinds of systems on the internet. Whenever you log into a website using your Google or Facebook login, this is an example of a federation identity system. In this particular video, I will use Active Directory Federation Services as the example system. However, the same theories apply to many of the other federation systems. Before I look at how a claim-based federation system would work, let us consider a fictional example to get an idea of the principles involved. Consider an employee who is working for a business called Business A. There is another business, called Business B, that this employee wants to get some information from. So the employee asks Business B for this information. Typically, this kind of request would go to their information desk. The information the employee is asking for is kept in the main office. The business is not going to allow people who they do not know into the main office, so the employee will need to go through the information desk in order to get this information. Also, it is up to the business if they want to release this information or not. At this stage, the answer they give back is no, because they do not know who the employee is, and they do not want to give someone they do not know any information. There is an arrangement between Business A and Business B to provide this information, but Business B will not release this information without the person proving who they are and that they are sure Company A wants them to have this information. So how does the employee prove who he is to the second company? In order to do this, the employee contacts his information desk. The company is quite big, so the information desk does not know who he is, so they contact someone in the main office to confirm his identity. The office will do their own kinds of checks, and once they are happy, will give the green light indicating that they believe he is one of their employees and he is entitled to ask for that information. Now that the information desk is happy, what they do is create a letter that they give to the employee. The letter indicates that this person works for their company and indicates the information that they are asking for. This letter is then given to the information desk for Business B. The problem is that Business B does not necessarily believe that the letter came from Business A, so they want to be able to check if the letter is authentic. In order to do this, Business A creates a rule book explaining how to check a letter issued by them to make sure it is authentic. Business A provides Business B with this rule book so they can now check any letters they are given to make sure they are authentic. Now that the information desk has the rule book, the information desk can check the letter to ensure that it is authentic. Now that the information desk knows the letter is authentic, they can give the employee the information. However, notice that Business B could still, if they wanted to, decline to give out this information, but in this case, they will release this information to the employee. Even though this is a fictional example, it shows the key points of a federation identity service. These are Business B being able to check that the employee is who he says he is without having to contact Business A. Business B is able to do this because they can verify that the letter given to them is authentic. So, how does all this relate to federation services? Let's consider this example again, but this time using Active Directory Federation Services. First of all, in this example, the employee is instead a mobile user using a laptop. To obtain the information they want, they will contact a web server in Business B asking for the data. This web server will, of course, be behind a firewall. The web server does not know who the user is and thus will reject the request, saying, "I need authorization first." The user will then contact Business B's Federation server asking for permission. The Federation server will also reject this request, saying that, "I want proof you are who you say you are." In order to get this proof, the user will contact the Federation server in Business A, where they work. Like the other Federation server, this will be on a perimeter or DMZ network, and thus will be separated from the Internet by a firewall. To verify the user is who they say they are, the user will give the Federation server their username and password. The user could be authenticated in any way that you choose. For example, they could be authenticated using smart cards. The Federation server will not know if the username and password given is correct, so it will pass the username and password to a domain controller on the internal network. Since the domain controller is on an internal network, there is a firewall between the two networks. You can see how this kind of system helps keep the network secure, as the user is not contacting the domain controller directly from the internet. The domain controller is able to check if the username and password are correct, and then responds back to the Federation server that the user is valid and the password given is correct. Now that the user has been verified, the Federation server creates what is referred to as a claim, which is given to the user. A claim contains information about who the user is and what they would like access to. The claim is signed using the server's certificate. In order for it to be checked by another server, the certificate needs to be exported from the Federation server and imported into the other Federation server. In this case, Business A will export a certificate containing its public key and send it to Business B. Transferring this certificate could be done using any media, for example, using email. This process only needs to be completed once. If the company were to purchase a certificate from a public CA, the public CA certificate may already be in the local certificate store, and thus the certificate may not need to be exported. The user now has a claim, which has been given to the Federation server in Business B. Since the Federation server in Business B has the certificate from the other Federation server, it can check the digital signature in the claim to make sure that it came from Business A's Federation server. If the Federation server is happy to allow the user access, remember it is still up to the Federation server to decide if they want the user to have access, the Federation server will approve the access. Now that the user has been approved to access the data, the user can once again contact the web server asking for the data. The web server does not have the data. The data is stored on the internal network, which is separated from the main network by a firewall. The web server will have access to the file server on the internal network, so it can request the file. Since the web server is on a company network, the file server allows the file to be transferred to the web server. The web server can then transfer the data to the user. It may look like there's a lot to this process, and in fact there is, but there are a number of advantages to doing it this way. To show this, I will have a quick look at what would be required using an Active Directory solution without Federation services. In order for a file to be accessed between the domains, a trust needs to be created. This will allow Business B to access Business A in order to check the username and password of users requesting access to files. This requires changes to firewalls on both networks. Since a trust relationship is being used, this requires a connection between both networks in order to operate. If the connection is broken, the trust will stop working. In order for a file transfer to occur, additional changes to the firewall rules need to be made. So, without going into too much detail about the requirements, you already need a trust relationship to be established and firewall changes to be made. The average business is not going to want to make these changes, and if the businesses do not trust each other, you can forget about the management approving a trust relationship between the two businesses. So now that you understand what is involved with an Active Directory solution, let's consider the advantage of using Federation services. Federation services do not require a connection-style trust to be created. We saw before that a certificate needs to be exported from one Federation server and used on the server. However, this is only required once and does not require a connection in order to work once set up. Federation Services uses standard web ports. There is a good chance these ports are already open on the firewall, and most businesses would have fewer issues opening these ports rather than opening non-standard ports. Access is determined by using a claim. Claims are file-based and issued by the authenticating company. This means the other company supplying the data does not need to worry about authenticating users. Claims use standard web protocols. This makes them compatible with other systems. In a later video, I will have a closer look at the protocols that claims use. This should give you a good idea of how claim-based federations work. However, I will look at one more example of how it works. Let's consider the following example. It is becoming more common for businesses to outsource some of their applications to external companies, like cloud-based services. For example, Microsoft offers Exchange and Office services in the cloud. In this example, I will consider Exchange as being run on an outsourced company and a mobile user is attempting to access the Exchange server. With users becoming more mobile, it makes more sense for a company to outsource software like Exchange, as this means the business no longer has the administrative overhead of running, backing up, and hiring staff for this purpose. In order for the user to access Exchange, they first contact an Outlook web server. The web server will not know who they are, so will respond back with, "I need authorization first." In order to get this authorization, the user will then contact the Federation server. The Federation server will also respond back saying it does not know who the user is. You need to give me a claim stating who you are and what you would like access to. In order to get this claim, the user will then contact their Federation server. The Federation server will require the user to be authenticated, so the user will contact a domain controller in order to be authenticated. Now, this is the important point to take away with Federation services. Notice that the company that is supplying the Exchange services has no control over authentication. This is completely controlled by the company using the service. This means the company keeps control over who can access the Exchange services. If a new employee is hired, the company can give them access to Exchange services. If an employee was to leave the company can also remove that user's access. The company also controls how the user authenticates. For example, using usernames and passwords, smart cards, or perhaps requiring them only to supply a valid email address, depending on what the company requirements are. The important point to take away is the authentication happens here and not by the company supplying the service. Once the domain controller has authenticated the user, it informs the Active Directory Federation server that the user has been authenticated. The Federation server then issues the user a claim. The user is then able to give this claim to the Federation server. The Federation server looks at the claim and is able to determine who the user is, what they want access to, and verify the claim is real using the digital signature in the claim. You may be wondering how a service like this would charge the business when it has no control over authentication. The charging will depend on who is providing the service, but it may be as simple as counting the number of users that access the service during a monthly period, or charging for the number of users that are currently active on the system, for example, 50 to 60 users. It is up to the company to make sure that they are in that range, or upgrade to a higher plan if they need more users. If the Federation server is happy with the claim, it will allow it. The user can then contact the Outlook web server and gain access to their email. You can see how using a claim-based system like this allows separation of a service and authentication using standard web ports. There has been a lot covered in this video, so let's have a quick look at the main points. Systems that use Federation services use standard web protocols and do not require connection-style trusts. For this reason, the big advantage of this is that it is generally easier to get management approval, since one does not need to make firewall changes or have a trust that requires a connection to work. The point to remember with any identity system is that it requires many different systems to work together. This is not always an easy thing to achieve. If you are using any of the Microsoft Cloud services with Active Directory Federation services, these will work together quite well and are well documented. Of course, Microsoft is going to take the time to make this process as simple as possible to ensure the success of these products. If you are using other systems, it may work quite easily, or then again, you may need to put a lot of effort into getting the systems to work with each other, and the documentation may be poor. Federation services, although good and saves you from having to get some management approvals to change settings like firewall settings or create trusts, is not always the silver bullet for your infrastructure, and thus you should be prepared to take time to set it up and get it working. The last point to remember is that it uses claims. I will cover claims in a later video, but essentially, a claim contains user information and what the user would like access to. In order for a user to gain access, they must present a claim to the claim-aware application in order to access the data or service. Claims are signed with a digital signature, ensuring that they are from a trusted source. I hope you've found this video informative. This is just one of the free videos that are part of the Federation Services course. For more videos, please see our YouTube channel or webpage. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.